It was actually at Sussex University in the 1960s that I became a creationist. And this is Professor John Maynard Smith. I don't know if you're familiar with his name. People like Richard Dawkins get all the fame and fortune, but people like Maynard Smith are the real workers in the field of evolution, and he was one of the world's leading evolutionists. He actually won prizes equivalent to the Nobel Prize for his contribution to evolutionary theory. Now, I didn't realize that when I went to Sussex University. It was, those of you who are old enough to know, a very kind of avant-garde place in the 1960s. It had only just opened. It was very kind of radical. It had radical students doing all sorts of things that got themselves into the newspapers. I didn't think of myself as a very radical person. I went up to university as a Christian, but as a convinced evolutionist. And I don't know why I was an evolutionist. I don't know where I learned it. I kind of absorbed it from the culture, but I was absolutely certain that evolution was a fact. Although I was also a Christian, this didn't give me a problem. I just filed them somehow in two separate parts of myself, and there was no conflict. Didn't think about it. When I did A-level zoology, that was the first time I was presented with evidence for evolution, and I realize now it was the standard evidences, the sort of things that's in Origin of Species, but I actually found it very unconvincing. This didn't throw me. I knew evolution was a fact. I thought it was simply that the evidence was too complex for an A-level student to grasp, and that someone else had the evidence, the real evidence. It's interesting that, though, isn't it? That even as a 17-year-old schoolgirl who didn't see this as an issue, it struck me that the evidence was not convincing, that the sorts of stuff that was being put forward was capable of more than one interpretation. But I arrived at Sussex University, John Maynard Smith, in the first year of the biology department. John Maynard Smith was the dean of the School of Biological Sciences. It was only a small group of us. We had personal contact with him. It was a great, great privilege. And he in fact lectured me on evolution and on the evidences for evolution. And now that I know what a famous and special person he was, I look back on it and think, I'm so glad I went there. I really do. And I really honor his memory, because it was a very good place to be. We were encouraged to follow the evidence where it leads. It was a radical cutting-edge course. It had done away with all the just chopping things up in the lab to focus on genetics and biochemistry and neurophysiology and all the sorts of things that interested me. And it was a rigorous training. We were taught to critique everything. You didn't just accept what anybody said. They had to prove it to you. You had to, and I'm not that kind of person, really. I found this side of it difficult. In the seminars, they were telling us, no, don't just accept what we've just told you. Criticize it, ask questions, And I did my best. But one day I had a great shock. This was towards the end of my 3 years, towards the end of my BSc course. I found that we were told we had to follow the evidence where it led, except if you queried evolution. Now remember, I was myself an evolutionist, and I'd met some creationists in the Christian Union. I didn't think much of them. Well, I thought they were nice people, but I didn't think much of their position because they weren't biologists. I thought they just don't know what they're talking about, and I didn't really pay them much attention, but I suppose it did niggle me a little bit. And one day I was in a seminar where we were discussing the evolution of the vertebrate eye, and obviously if evolution is true, and if it's followed the course that it's supposed to have followed, from molecules up through very simple creatures to multicellular creatures to invertebrates to vertebrates, then the eyes have to follow that same course. I mean, the whole creature has to evolve from one step to the next. It can't do it in bits, can it? Well, that was the concept. So you can't have one part of it evolving and another not. So it had to evolve from an invertebrate type eye to a vertebrate type eye. And that's what we were discussing in this seminar. But as we talked round and round in circles on it, well, I didn't say much, I just listened to the others. It was clearly impossible because the two systems work on completely different basic principles. So eventually I said, well, if we can't see how it's happened, perhaps we should question whether it has happened. And I was absolutely astonished at the response that I got, because there was a shocked silence. There'd been a lot of, debate and noise, and the place went completely silent. And somebody began to mock me for believing in God. I hadn't mentioned God. I hadn't actually really thought about him when I said this. The person leading the seminar, who up to then had been gentle and encouraging and trying to get us all to say as much as possible, said in a very harsh and sort of decisive way, I remember his words, "I'm not going to get involved in any controversy. Stop." And so for the very first time, I was silenced. Creationists are silenced. And here I wasn't even a creationist, and I was already being silenced. And that, I'm afraid, has been the pattern ever since. The evidence is not allowed to lead you away from evolution. It's okay as long as it leads in the right direction, but not if you challenge the idea of evolution itself. And so the ideological nature of evolutionary theory was revealed to me in a flash. I thought, this is different. This is not the science we've been trained in. And although I probably couldn't have articulated it at that time, I saw evolution for what it was, not essentially a scientific theory, although it does include science, obviously. And it's interesting, though, that was in 1968, probably early 1968 or late 67. 10 years later, papers began to come out by prestigious scientists saying, you probably know this, the eye has evolved 40 different times or 20 different times. They had come to that conclusion. The evidence in the end had forced them to that conclusion, and they had abandoned the whole scheme of whereby one evolved into another and began to say that it evolved 20 different times. So that was the way of reconciling evolutionary theory with what the evidence actually was. And that, again, reveals its ideological nature, you see. There's a guy called David Stove. He's a bit infamous. He's dead now, I think, but he was a philosopher, and he's written a book called Darwinian Fairy Tales. He's not a Christian, or wasn't a Christian as far as I know, certainly not a creationist. But in his book, Darwinian Fairy Tales, he describes animal behavior which doesn't fit with Darwinian thought at all. And then he says, such cases, I need hardly say, never bother armour-plated neo-Darwinians, but then no cases, possible or even actual, ever do bother them. In neo-Darwinism's house, there are many mansions, so many indeed, that if a certain awkward fact still will not fit into one mansion, then it is sure to be another one into which it will fit to admiration. And that's what happened, you see, with this eye thing. They came up with a different explanation. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it reveals there's nothing wrong with it unless you were saying that evolution is purely and simply a scientific theory. If you're admitting that it's not, that it's actually a religious idea, essentially, an ideological idea, then that is the way such a thing operates, of course. So this was confirmed for me, really. Well, it has been many times over in the past 40 years. But you can see for yourselves an interview with John Maynard Smith conducted in 2001. If you just Google John Maynard Smith, you will find this very easily under this thing, meaningoflife.tv/video, you'll find him. And this is what he says. It's a long interview, but the interviewer asks him, how did you first come to believe in evolution? And he says, I remember reading Darwin when I was at school. I'd been raised in the Church of England. Reading Darwin, I thought, this is an alternative explanation. Philosophical and religious implications first got me excited. It was an enormous relief to escape from religion. Now that's very similar to what Richard Dawkins will say. He actually says almost exactly the same thing. that in his teens at school, it was such a relief to him to be able to turn to Darwinism and abandon religion. So you see, the religious, semi-religious, ideological nature of Darwinism is revealed there in two of its chief exponents. So what is Darwinism then? Well, listen to this from Maynard Smith, again from the same interview. You can ask exactly the same questions of a bird's wing as of a piece of engineering. In the case of the engineering, you ask, why did the designer make it like that? In the case of the bird's wing, you ask, why did natural selection make it like that? The kind of thinking you do is exactly the same. Natural selection and design produce the same results. Natural selection is a process of design, even if it doesn't design consciously. I think that last sentence, actually, the interviewer fed back to him. So you're saying natural selection is a process of design, even if it doesn't design consciously? And he says, yes, that's exactly right. So that's what Darwinism is about. And if you read around what happened in the middle of the 19th century, you will see that it is exactly what it was about. Regardless of what people may say today, I honestly feel they should check up a bit more closely on their history. It's very easy to do these days because it's all on the web. Darwinism was about replacing the designer. It was about eliminating the designer. So my question is, should it have done that? I mean, it effectively did replace the designer, didn't it? By our day, we can see that the designer has been banned. He's been totally banned. He's not allowed in school classrooms, he's not allowed in university departments, and Darwinism has replaced him. But is that a good thing? And should it have happened? I want to introduce you, if you don't know him already, to Professor Steve Fuller, Professor of Sociology at Warwick University. I'm actually a research student at Warwick University, but I've never met Steve Fuller. Wish I had. He is not a Christian. He calls himself a secular humanist. He has written extensively on the history of evolution and the whole history of the development of science. I'm going to be quoting from him extensively because you might be quite surprised at what he comes up with. Now remember, he is not a Christian, he is not a creationist. He has arrived at this from his study of the history of science. And he says the track record of neo-Darwinism is parasitic on prior creationist breakthroughs, over which neo-Darwinists now claim sole ownership, and which creationists have yet to claim back as their own. Now that's in his book. He's written a lot, but he's written two important books. One came out this year, one last. This is from his book, Descent Over Dissent, Intelligent Design's Challenge to Darwinism. So what he is saying is there have been creationist breakthroughs in the history of science, and neo-Darwinism is parasitic on those, and it's not acknowledging the history that led up to it, and creationists have got to claim this history back as theirs. The history of much of science, and particularly this area of biology, belongs to creationists. Well, to biology in general, belongs to creationists. That's what Steve Fuller is saying. And he's urging people who believe this to properly claim it back. So actually, that's what I'm going to try and do tonight. I'm going to try and claim back genetics because I'm going to now try and show that modern genetics owes everything to creationism and virtually nothing to Darwinism. In fact, it may actually be nothing. That's maybe something we can debate at the end. I'm not sure that genetics owes anything at all to Darwinism. Certainly doesn't owe much. And on the contrary, Darwinism hindered, I believe, the development of modern genetics. And where might we be if that had not happened? So the question is that there's Wycliffe's Bible there. Wycliffe was the person who first translated the Bible into English in the 14th century. We've had the Bible in English that many hundreds of years. So is it the influence of the Bible that has led to modern genetics, or is it the influence of Darwinism? That's the question that we're going to look at. I want to take you along a creationist trajectory, a path. I mean, obviously this is very sweeping and in a sense simplistic. As we know, at any one time there are many people working in any particular field, and I'm just going to select 3 people, one from each century, but they are key people. As you will see, they are very, very significant people. So let's quote Steve Fuller again. I quote him wherever I can, even if I think I can say it better actually, because he's a bit long-winded sometimes. But I want to, rather than paraphrase him, which I could have done, I hope you don't mind, I'm actually going to quote him directly. I think it's important I do, so that you know this is not just coming from me, because obviously I am a creationist myself, and he is not. But he says, what is now called Mendelian genetics was contributed by people who held the counter-Darwinian assumption that every member of a species, regardless of its generational history, is programmed with a reproductive propensity. That assumption is a legacy of special creationism, a research tradition in natural history that connects the devout Linnaeus and Mendel. That's from his book from last year, Science versus Religion, Intelligent Design and the Problem of Evolution. So he is saying, in a rather convoluted sentence there, what I've been saying to you, that genetics actually is a legacy of special creationism. Now, some people even try to deny the Christian roots of science, but most people do know that most early scientists, certainly most key early scientists, were Christians. But they tend to take the line that if they lived today, they wouldn't be. Now, if they say that, they really do not understand what was going on. And in this year, when we have got coming up Darwin's 200th birthday in February, and in exactly a year's time, November next year, will be the 150 years since Origin of Species was published. We're focused on history, and while we're at it, we ought to really grasp this. What it means that modern science has Christian roots. Because it isn't simply that they happen to be Christians. Now we're all enlightened Darwinists, and if Isaac Newton and co means very many people, if they were alive today, they would not be creationists. It's absolute, well, words fail me. It just shows that people have not grasped what it means that science has Christian roots. They did their science because they were Christians. It followed directly from their Christian beliefs. And Steve fully recognizes this and knows it. So, in fact, many of the most significant scientists have been Christian theists, not naturalists. People like Maynard Smith himself and Richard Dawkins and many, many of modern scientists are naturalists, or materialists would be another word to use for it, in that they only recognize the material, the natural world, nothing supernatural. It's a kind of elimination of the supernatural. So that the claim that science is rightly confined just to the natural and you don't include the supernatural anywhere. So that's naturalism, but that is actually not what gave rise to modern science. That is not what many of the most successful and significant scientists have believed. Isaac Newton would be one of them, of course. But the foundational influence of creationist thought can be seen in this trajectory I'm going to introduce you to now, but I want you to know that it doesn't just apply to genetics. It applies to virtually every branch of science. That key discoveries have been made not just by Christians, but by Christians who were soaked in the Bible and who had strongly creationist beliefs. So the current situation where creationists are ridiculed and told that they're ruining science, that they're ruining children by teaching them this, is just a travesty of the truth. Otherwise you're going to say that Isaac Newton couldn't have done his science. But let's think of our biologists. The trajectory I'm talking about now involved 3 key biologists working in 3 different centuries. There was John Ray, who is known as the father of natural history. There's Carl Linnaeus, I'm choosing to, he did his name several different ways. I'm choosing to do it that way. He was in the 18th century, the father of modern taxonomy. And there was Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, in the 19th century. Now, these are not random, unconnected people. They are people who were working in a research tradition, as Steve Fuller has pointed out. He mentioned Linnaeus and Mendel. He could have mentioned Ray as well, as I'm going to show you. The father of natural history, Ray. The father of modern taxonomy, Linnaeus. The father of modern genetics, Mendel. I mean, you have to be somebody quite special to be called the father of something, don't you? And these people were all not just Bible believers, but creationists. So let's take them one by one. John Ray, the father of natural history. Now, this is a quote from a website from the University of California, Berkeley, about him. A devout Christian, Ray expounded his belief in natural theology, the doctrine that the wisdom and power of God could be understood by studying his creation, the natural world. This doctrine can be traced back to the Bible, but Ray expressed it so fully and so clearly that he started a long tradition of natural theology in England and abroad. So these are strange terms to us these days. It's a bit difficult to get them inside one's head because we're so used now to thinking of nature divorced from theology. But what we're saying here is that this man, John Ray, and he wasn't the only one, there were quite a lot of people doing something similar to this, but he was so successful that he's called the father of it. He desired to know God. That was his motivation. It was desiring to know God and believing that the Bible taught that God could be known in his creation, that he actually established this tradition of natural theology, studying creation in order to know God. Now, Isaac Newton, who obviously was a contemporary of his, did very much the same thing. That was his motivation too. I mean, he was an unusual, one might almost say weird at times, character. But he was not an exemplary Christian in every respect, but in the way he did his science and his motivation for his science, I think he was. Because Isaac Newton too was seeking to know God. For example, he studied light because he saw in the Bible that it says God is light. So the motivation for these people came directly from the Bible. Not only that, the motivation came because they believed it was possible, and Steve Fuller describes this very well in his books. He's grasped it, even though he's not a Christian himself, that because they believed the world was created, and because they believed humans were made in the image of God, because these are things the Bible teaches that Christianity teaches, then they saw that it was possible for people to think God's thoughts after him. That expression was used by several of them. I think it was used by Newton himself, I think, when he made a discovery. I'm thinking God's thoughts after him. It was this belief that there was a God, that the world was designed, the universe was designed, people were designed, nature was designed by God, and that people had the same kind of mind as God. Obviously, God is, he's different in many respects. But the Bible teaches we're made in his image. It was this truth that they were working on. If there is no God, if everything is random, what is the reason for doing science? And Steve Fuller himself says he cannot see any reason for doing science unless you are a creationist. Now that's an unbeliever speaking. It's because of this view of the world that it's possible to study it, that it's possible to understand it, that there's something about its workings that humans might be able to describe. That is what led to the development of modern science. And John Ray was a very good example of it in this field of biology. So he wrote, some big books. One was called The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation. I'm not expecting you to go and read them, although you might want to, but it's really to show you the kind of thing that he wrote after all his biological work. And 3 physico-theological discourses I think actually he preached a lot of this stuff as sermons originally. And this university website says, such deep religious feeling may seem out of place in scientific writing today, but Ray's work actually represented a huge advance for science. It has normally been Christians, or believers of some sort, usually Christians, who have taken science forward in big leaps. And his theology is strikingly different from modern biological thought. Yet his goal of a natural system of classification inspired Linnaeus and generations of systematists after Linnaeus to collect, document, and classify organisms. Ray's work began to bring order to the study of species. Now, you see, if you believe in a random world, and people did at that time, they weren't all Christians or all believers, where do you begin to study it? But if you believe, as the Bible teaches, that things are actually created in groups, that you can define groups of creatures, because that's what Genesis 1 says, then people like Ray began to look for those groups and began to impose a sort of order on what they saw out there, because they believed that that was what the setup was. And as we know, this became a very successful thing. He was what became known as a special creationist. In other words, species. In other words, things had been created in groups. That's what that essentially means, because the Bible teaches that God created in the beginning according to different kinds. So he described on this basis and classified thousands, he was a very hard worker, thousands of species of plants, birds, insects, mammals, fish and reptiles. And he based his system of classification on his observations of anatomy and physiology and the creature's environment, how it related to its environment. And he paved the way for the work of Linnaeus the following century, which leads us to Linnaeus himself. Now his name, he worked with hybrids. His name is actually a hybrid there. He started off being called Carl von Linné. He was Swedish. Ray, of course, was British English. Then he gave himself a Latin name, but it's hard to say. So sometimes it's written like this. So his name is half Swedish, half Latin, or half German, half Latin, whatever. So he was born in the following century and is known as the father of modern taxonomy. Now it's important to realise that his work depended directly on Ray's work. He was following on from Ray and others. He was from a Lutheran background, strongly biblical background, and he gave us our modern classification system, the binomial system, where Homo sapiens would be an example. You have the genus Homo and the species sapiens. This was Linnaeus who formulated that, whose name is associated mainly with that. He was directly influenced by Genesis chapter 1 again. He was looking for the Genesis kinds again. And you'll note that he was born in 1707, so he was actually 300 years old last year. And so there were special exhibitions to do with Linnaeus last year and special write-ups. And this is, at the bottom, is a quote from that. He remained a naive believer in the Genesis account of creation, the Times newspaper said. It said how people have tried to present him as some kind of evolutionist, but they said actually it can't be done. He actually remained a naive believer in the Genesis account of creation all his life. Now, this is what is so unfair, you see. It was because he was a naive believer in the Genesis account of creation that he actually did his work. That's not taken account of or understood. And that is what I'm trying to convey. I'm not just saying these people were Christians. I'm saying it's because they were Christians. It was the Christianity that gave rise to the work that they did. So again, he was looking to see if animals were in specific groups because he believed they were, because that was what the Bible taught. And he classified them that way because, again, he was looking for the kinds and how you actually, what does the Bible mean by kind, and how do you group things, living things. So let's hear what Steve Fuller has to say about Carl Linnaeus. Now look at this. By his death in 1778, Linnaeus was widely regarded as the most significant scientist since Newton. Isn't that incredible? He'd had that much impact. He had done for biology what Newton did for the physical sciences. Both of them were strong creationists. Both of them did their work because they were creationists. To say that if Isaac Newton lived today, he'd be an evolutionist, or Linnaeus would be, well, I'm lost for words. And Fuller says, both these scientists exemplified a synergy, between cutting-edge science and enlightened Christianity. And science continued to be indebted to creationism in the 19th century. So he's talking about how long this influence of creationism lasted, Fuller is, and he's saying that both Linnaeus and Newton married together cutting-edge science and enlightened Christianity, and that's why they were so successful. Fuller still. Thus, while Darwin denied that biological species were either specially created, immutable, or intelligently designed, he nevertheless retained Linnaeus's binomial classification of species. So you see, he worked with what a creationist had done, but sought to eliminate the very basis on which that work had been done. So, just to repeat, both Ray and Linnaeus were special creationists. They believed that God had created organisms in specific groups called kinds in the Bible, and it was special creationism that gave the impetus which led to modern genetics. We're getting there, we're getting to modern genetics, but we haven't quite got there yet. This is an important point. Linnaeus originally believed that species could not change. Now, species is actually something that's very difficult to define. You need a different definition, for example, for bacteria than you do for animals. It's not an easy thing to define, but however they were defining it then, Linnaeus originally believed, as did a lot of other Christians, that species could not change in any way. But he changed his mind, and this wasn't, the more one reads up on this, I mean, I'm still learning a lot about this. And I've only just realised, I thought he came to that conclusion later in his life. But from what I've read recently, I think that isn't the case, that he quite early on came to realise that this wasn't totally true, because viable hybrid forms of plants could be produced. Hybridisation was of great interest to them, where they cross-fertilised, particularly it is easy to do in plants, of course, much less easy in animals to bring it about. Well, very difficult in animals, but in plants you can get these hybrid specimens. So what Linnaeus came to believe was that there was some limited flexibility within the original created kinds, so that, for example, you could produce a hybrid which was slightly different from the parent, the two original parent plants, and which bred true, which wasn't sterile. Hybrids often are sterile, but Linnaeus realised that sometimes they weren't. And so he changed his mind. And he came to believe that God had created the kinds with the potential for limited change. They were still essentially the same plant, but rather than at the level of the species, he took it back to the level of the genus and even to higher levels in some plant instances. But they are still basically the same kind, but he was discovering that there was a potential for change. And I'm stressing this because this actually is the standard position held by many creationists today. It dates back as far as Linnaeus in the 18th century. This is the fruitful position the one that led on to modern genetics, that the original kinds were stable, but within the kinds there was flexibility and potential for variation. Very definite boundaries to it, but not completely static, as some creationists did say. And Linnaeus felt he had proved that to be wrong, and he was able to change his mind about it. And so now we move on another 100 years and come to Gregor Mendel, who is known as the father of modern genetics. He was a monk. Now, you probably know the story of Mendel, how he worked with peas, doing, again, he was very interested in hybridization, did a lot of hybridizing type crosses. He applied statistics. He handled it very mathematically. He developed statistical relationships from his results, of how he published his work, of how it was not acknowledged, and he died without seeing any of the fame that subsequently came to him. So the picture on the left is a memorial to him in the place where he lived, which I think is in the Czech Republic. It's one of those parts of the world that changes, but it's that kind of a area. That he died having no idea that there would be big public memorials to him and that he would be so famous. As you can see, he was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, a monk living and working in a monastery. Very different background to Charles Darwin, who obviously was very moneyed. He never had to work for a living. Darwin, he was not a professional scientist. He was able to live on inherited wealth, and Mendel was in such a different position. But Mendel was another special creationist who built directly on the work of Linnaeus. He picked up the interest in hybrids that Linnaeus had had. He was seeking to understand, as Linnaeus was as well, how inheritance worked to produce both stability and variety. That's an interesting question, isn't it? Because God had created in these different kinds, and yet what we know there is a lot of variety. What was the actual mechanism of inheritance that made this possible? And as I've said, he believed the problem could be investigated mathematically, and he did apply maths to it, statistics to it. And this is what has not been recognized until very recently. His work was done in deliberate opposition to Darwinism. He did not believe in descent with modification. He was actively working to show that it wasn't true. Now, some people think that he specifically only started his experiments after Origin of Species was published. It's more likely he started them before. But you've got to remember that Origin of Species the picture we often have is not the real one. There was lots of debate going on beforehand. The book coming out and people like Huxley promoting it brought about this big change in public opinion, but the ideas were there before. So there was always, once we got into the 19th century, the conflict between the people who believed in design and in creation and those who were wishing to believe in a form of evolution but felt that they didn't have a mechanism for it. What Darwin seemed to put forward was a mechanism for it. But what is absolutely plain is that Mendel, this is completely plain from his papers, that he was opposed to Darwinism. He was actually another special creationist, as you would expect from a monk living at that time. What he actually showed was that when a new variety appeared, the cause could, I'm using the words genes and genome here in a modern sense, which obviously he wouldn't have done. It's hard to get back into the mindset of how it was in the 19th century, isn't it? So I'm using those words. You have to forgive me. It's not, if you're purist, it's not strictly right, but I hope you will understand what I'm saying. The cause would be a new combination of genes that had always been present. Nothing new had been added to the genome. Now, Darwin knew that hybrids were not good news for him if this was all that was happening. I mean, he has a chapter on it in Origin of Species. He deals with this question and of this kind of question, that if you get change, but in the way that nothing new has been added, then his sort of evolution cannot happen. Because Darwinism requires that new varieties should have new genetic causes, whereas that was not what Mendel's experiments showed. They showed that, yes, you could combine hybrids to produce a lot of variety in the next generation, and new tendencies could appear that look new to you, but then Mendel demonstrated that this was simply a re-emergence of a genetic factor. He didn't know what it was, but of some factor being passed down had re-emerged, and it had been there all the time. That's why Mendelism was in such conflict with Darwinism. It was, and Mendel knew it was, and Mendel was not an evolutionist at all, not at all. He was specifically opposed to evolution, and that has been quite misrepresented. So let's see what Steve Fuller has to say. He's got something to say on it. Darwin fundamentally resisted the idea that nature possesses a machine-like structure that might imply, as it did for Newton, a divine mechanic. This came out of his inability, if not refusal, to fathom the mathematical formulae that purported to provide evidence for statistical laws of heredity, sent to him by Gregor Mendel shortly after publication of Origin of Species. Because there's another myth, you see, that people just didn't know about Mendel's work. Well, they did know. Darwin himself knew. So it wasn't that they didn't know about it. What happened was that they rejected it. This was why it needed to be rediscovered or re-highlighted. I mean, it had always been known about 40 years later. But can you see what I said at the beginning? That we have this trajectory, this very fruitful trajectory going from Ray through Linnaeus, through Mendel, 300 years of fruitful development. Darwinism was a complete sidetrack that had nothing to do with it except that it held it up. And because of this problem, that Mendelism did not support Darwinism, the results were rejected on ideological grounds. Now again, I've got papers with me, not written by Christians, that will spell this out to you, not written by creationists. Remember that Darwinism was seeking to eliminate the designer. That's what it was all about. And Mendel's theory of inheritance ruled out Darwinism because it supported the creationist idea of a designed capacity for variation. It showed that the capacity for variation had been there all along. Darwinism needs new variation coming from who knows where, and he didn't know where, of course. And that was a big problem with Origin of Species. So I'm telling you that people seriously need to read their history as we approach the Darwin bicentennial. Because the picture is that that the publication of Origin of Species swept everything before it. Well, it swept a lot before it, it has to be said. Huxley, Thomas Henry Huxley, launched a popularizing, well, Darwin launched it, I think, but Huxley did it, went around the country, and he wasn't the only one, but he was very successful, promoting Darwinism. Many, many people turned to Darwinism, but not most scientists. It was accepted by the church, it was accepted by the general population, but it wasn't really accepted by, well, it certainly wasn't accepted by all scientists. I wouldn't like to hazard a guess at the percentage, but it probably was a minority that accepted it. Because contrary to popular accounts, Darwin failed to offer a properly mechanistic account of evolution because he lacked a credible theory of hereditary transmission. Listen to this. Indeed, by the time Origin of Species reached its 50th birthday in 1909, Darwin's theory was close to extinction in biology, though it continued to enjoy admirers in theology and sociology. So it was essentially a sociological theory, you see, that was given a biological twist by Darwin. Herbert Spencer, I mean, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not claiming to know a huge amount about that side of it, but I do know that the idea predated Darwin in the realm of economics and sociology, and the survival of the fittest sort of idea. And it was Darwin introduced it to biology, but he did not have a theory of how it could happen. Not in terms of the actual inheritance, the sort of thing that Mendel was working on. In fact, Darwinists could only offer just so stories to explain species change. Remember, this is Steve Fuller writing, professor of sociology and history of science, expert in the history of science, who is not a creationist or a Christian. So Darwinism floundered. Now, Mendelism, to go back to Mendel, floundered for 40 years because of the fact that it didn't support Darwinism. Some people sympathetic to Mendelism helped to resurrect it in the early part of the 20th century. And that created an even bigger problem for Darwinism, because now genetics was moving forward, but it still didn't marry up with Darwinism. Now, again, this is something people don't appreciate, and again, Steve Fuller has something to say about it, and he doesn't mince his words. And these are not my words. I don't even know if I agree with this, but I thought, well, see what you make of it. Contrary to how the matter is sometimes portrayed in folk histories of science, evolution became the common theoretical paradigm of the life sciences only once natural history and experimental genetics were unified in the 1930s and 1940s, listen to this, in carefully crafted textbooks and popular histories as the neo-Darwinian synthesis. This feat was largely the work of Theodosius Dobzhansky and Julian Huxley. If it appears that the life sciences have been brought closer together in the aftermath of their efforts, that is due at least as much to the concentration of financial backing and political interest as to genuine intellectual breakthroughs in molecular biology. Now, isn't it interesting when sociologists get let loose on all of this? You see, it gives you a completely different perspective, doesn't it? Well, I don't know about the financial backing and political interest thing, but I do know that until the 1930s and 40s, Darwinism and Mendelism were on two different paths, and it was the genetics that was being established and the Darwinism that was not. And they managed to marry them up in what became known as the neo-Darwinian synthesis in the 30s and 40s, with the idea that mutations at the level of the DNA produce the raw material for natural selection to act on. But today, that neo-Darwinian synthesis is being seriously questioned by evolutionists behind closed doors. They wouldn't dare say it very much in public, because, not that I've been behind the closed doors with them, but it does occasionally leak out. And you can see why. Because Darwinism, neo-Darwinism, any kind of Darwinism, depends on the idea that small random DNA mutations with small effects account for evolutionary change. But the more that's discovered in the fields of molecular biology and genetics, the harder it is becoming to provide neo-Darwinian explanations. Let's take just one example. How can neo-Darwinism explain the origin of meiosis? Now remember, it's got to be able to explain everything. If it can't explain everything, it doesn't work, does it? So I don't know if you can remember what meiosis is if you're not a biologist, if you learnt about it at school or since. It's a very, very mysterious and complicated thing. And meiosis is the form of cell division that gives rise to the gametes, the sex cells. Without it, there can be no sexual reproduction. Because I'm sure you're all aware that your cells have a certain number of chromosomes. They do in plants and animals. And the sex cells have got to have half that number because the number of chromosomes is definitive. And you know that terrible conditions result if you have just one too many, normally fatal. I mean, occasionally, as we know, there are one or two conditions where you can survive with an extra chromosome. Normally, if that happens, it's fatal. So you couldn't have a double set. So sex cannot evolve, sexual reproduction cannot evolve until you have meiosis. And without meiosis, you would not get evolution beyond a very simple stage in which creatures can reproduce asexually, just by dividing, or in some other way asexually. But meiosis is an unimaginably complex process. And listen to John Maynard Smith. Now, I have a genuine admiration and respect for John Maynard Smith. He was not a bit like Richard Dawkins. Much more respectful, much more willing to face difficulties. And this is what he says, again, in that interview from 2001. It is genuinely difficult to come up with an explanation for the evolution of meiosis, an immensely complex process. We can only guess. Now, Maynard Smith is a genuine expert, and he is freely admitting that he has no idea how meiosis happens. You can see there the one cell dividing into four, not into two, which the other process of mitosis would be doing. It has to divide into four in order to reduce by half the number of chromosomes. What happens first is the DNA doubles up, but there is this, and the chromosomes come and lie together in pairs. But there is this amazing swapping of information, this amazing inbuilt capacity for variety, for variation, just exactly what Linnaeus and Mendel were thinking about and looking for, the capacity for variation. And then there's the mechanism by which the chromosomes get drawn to the poles of the cell, and the whole thing, you see, the DNA is supposed to be the information carrying a part of the cell, sending out the messages, but it needs these messages to happen. This whole process must be governed by some kind of code, by some kind of information. Well, Maynard Smith freely admits he has no idea how that could have evolved. The process itself has had to evolve, you see. But it gets worse for neo-Darwinism, because meiosis has been known about for a long time, decades and decades. But now, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in where the field is at the moment. I most definitely am not that, but I invite you to go and look it up for yourself. The amount of information coming out is explosive. I doubt if anyone knows all of it, and I certainly don't know much. But I know enough to be astonished that the mechanisms which produce variety have proved to be extensive but very complex, and they all involve existing genes. Now, remember that Darwin himself could see that that created an issue. Variation that was there before was no good to him. He had to have new information. But all the systems for variety that we've got, these are some fields dealing with this kind of thing. Symbiogenesis, that would have to be critiqued a lot, but it's where two organisms combine, essentially. Hybridogenesis, where they combine in a different sense as hybrids. Horizontal gene transfer, particularly in bacteria, they can transfer the genes amongst the gene pool, amongst themselves, between each other. Those are mechanisms by which genetic material can be combined or transferred between cells and create variety. They do not explain how the genetic material arose in the first place, nor how the mechanisms themselves arose. That's the thing, you see. We've had a genetic code, but the genetic code is not in itself not going to be enough to explain how these things happen. I was at a lecture given by Professor Steve Jones, who, as you probably know, is a leading geneticist and certainly one the media deal with a lot. And the lecture was entitled "Why Creationism is Wrong and Evolution is Right." And the theme, the first few minutes were talking about how ridiculous creationists are. And then he moved into talking about how the HIV virus has changed. And very interesting lecture. He's a good communicator, knew a lot. I was sitting there thinking, well, when's he going to talk about something to do with creation? So then it finished, and they asked for questions. So I put my hand up, and they were very pleased that someone put their hand up and asked me what my question was. So I came clean. I said, I'm a creationist. I said, it's a very interesting lecture, but it has nothing to do with the creation-evolution debate, because creationists don't doubt that viruses can change. In fact, once you've got genes, or whatever viruses have got, any amount of change could happen, but it doesn't tell you where the genes came from in the first place. So that's the question that evolution has got to answer. Where did the genes come from in the first place? Do you know what his answer was? Oh, we've no idea. Absolutely no idea. So, but you see, that is the whole point. Once you have a complex genetic mechanism, if you swap it around, chop it, recombine it, chop it about, insert bits here, take bits out there, yes, you're going to get variety. That's not the point. The point is, where did it all come from in the first place? And then there is epigenetics, which is a term referring to processes which cause changes in gene expression by mechanisms other than changes in the underlying DNA sequence. Now, you see, that shouldn't, under standard neo-Darwinism, that shouldn't happen. It implies there are other codes, other information, or information stored differently than just in the straightforward reading of the DNA. And there's a lot of evidence coming out that that is true. This is a simplified, just to give you the gist of it, we now have an epigenetic code, or probably loads of them actually, as well as a genetic code to account for. Codes sitting on top of codes. Now, this is a quotation from two evolutionists. The inheritance of epigenetic variations is a direct challenge to the evolutionary synthesis. And this is the sort of thing that's being said behind closed doors. The neo-Darwinian synthesis is not adequate to explain these findings, because it just deals with very small changes in the DNA itself. And these are complex information layers. You can see where it's at. It just doesn't work. Now, that doesn't mean to say that evolution will be dropped. It won't. They will come out with a new synthesis of some sort. But this is what I believe, that Ray, Linnaeus and Mendel were pursuing a very fruitful path, and Darwinism brought it to a halt. What is needed now is for it to be resumed. That was the fruitful path, when they based their view of biology on a creationist, a biblical framework. And so much time has been wasted trying to squeeze the amazing findings of modern cell biology and genetics into a Darwinian mold. For Darwinism to be true, it needs to be able to explain everything to do with life without reference to a designer and in terms of random inheritable changes. So let's just finish by going to what will probably be the final hurdle for evolution, to account for consciousness. I'm not departing from the theme, because genes have got to be able to explain consciousness. A final word, if genes are all we are, which is what Dawkins basically believes, isn't it? Selfish genes are what it's all about. A final word from John Maynard Smith, spoken in 2001. See, his honesty again. I have no way of explaining consciousness. It is entirely inexplicable, and mysterious. He died in 2004. Some final words from Steve Fuller. Who's afraid of biblical literalism? This is what he says. A literal reading of the Bible has done more to help than hurt science over the centuries. That's the opinion of a secular humanist writer. Neo-Darwinism needs to justify the continued pursuit of science, given the diminished cosmic status that the theory accords our species. That's his way of expressing what I was saying earlier, and he does elaborate more in his writings, that this view of us as just an evolved animal would not lead you to do science. It was only because people who had a different view of the world and of people had got science going that people are able to carry it on. And very brilliantly, nobody's denying that. But the impetus came from a completely different worldview. And Steve Fuller says, while I cannot honestly say that I believe in a divine personal creator, no plausible alternative has yet been offered to justify the pursuit of science. And these are his words. I would be more polite. Even if most scientists nowadays call themselves atheists, atheism as a positive doctrine has done precious little for science.